Here we go. The recording has begun. My name is Will Hull, and this is going to be Colorado Unit 2 from Division D for the hearing for the We the People National Finals. In a moment, I'll have the judges introduce themselves, followed by the students, and then we'll begin our hearing. The students will deliver a 4-minute prepared statement, followed by 8 minutes of judge follow-up questions. My microphone will be muted during the session. However, I will be holding up a 1-minute sign, as well as a time sign to indicate those periods of the hearing. I suggest, if you haven't done so already, up in your very top right-hand corner, there is a, sorry, let this thing focus a little bit. I'm not important anyway, but the view up in the very top right-hand corner, you'll be able to click on that and change it to gallery view so you can see all of the judges. And at the conclusion of the hearing, the judges will provide some brief feedback for you, and then we'll conclude the hearing. With that, I will go ahead and pass the microphone over to our judging panel, where they will introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Julie Silverbrook. I'm the Senior Director of Partnerships and Constitutional Scholar in Residence at iCivics.
Good afternoon. My name is Tim Igo. I am a lawyer, writer, and monthly magazine editor at the State Bar of Arizona in Phoenix.
And I'm Nick Drummond. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Black Hills State University in South Dakota.
Hi, I'm Ruby Luthold, and I'm a junior.
I'm Annabelle Filippini, and I'm a junior.
I'm Hagen Archer, and I'm a senior.
I'm Stephanie Danahay, and I'm a junior.
I'm Ellie Adams, and I'm a junior.
Great. I will now let you know which question you'll be answering this afternoon. You will be answering question 1, which I will now read to you in full. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? What issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? You may begin whenever you're ready.
The future of America's democratic experiment hung in the balance at the Constitutional Convention. The delegates quickly agreed that a new constitution was needed, but struggled to agree on details. Fundamental disagreements were frequent, and some were resolved by compromises that have not stood the test of time. Representation in Congress, slavery, and the powers of Congress were among the most critical disagreements, and the question of a Bill of Rights was only resolved after the convention as a result of the ratification process. Regarding representation, Madison's Virginia plan proposed proportional representation for the House and Senate, which favored large states. In response, smaller states proposed the New Jersey plan, which gave each state equal representation like in the Articles of Confederation. Eventually, this led to the Great Compromise, under which the Senate would have equal state representation and the House of Representatives proportional representation.
The Great Compromise only heightened the debates over whether slaves should be counted in the apportionment of the House. Northerners objected that counting slaves in the allocation of House seats would give Southern states too much power and would encourage the slave trade. In response, Southerners demanded that slaves be counted in the apportionment and defended the slave trade. Ultimately, the delegates agreed on James Wilson's compromise that representation would be based on free population plus 3/5 of the rest. And the convention compromised to prohibit any congressional action barring the Atlantic slave trade until 1808.
The overwhelming majority of the delegates wanted to create a stronger national government with far greater congressional powers. But how much greater those powers should be was still the subject of great debate. This included fierce arguments over taxation and regulation of commerce. After much disagreement, the delegates agreed upon the taxing clause, which gave Congress the power to collect taxes, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the country. The delegates also agreed to give Congress broad authority to regulate foreign and interstate commerce under the Commerce Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause gave Congress the authority to enact laws to implement these powers. This gave the national government the power to create a national system of trade and commerce and prevent competition among the several states.
The convention's compromises on issues like slavery, federal versus state power, and even the Electoral College led to significant future consequences. Among these, the Constitution's fatal compromise on slavery stands out. Tragically and inexcusably, slavery continued for another 75 years. Ultimately, in 1857, the Supreme Court decided the Dred Scott v. John F.A. Sanford case, which ruled that a slave who had resided in a free state and territory was not thereby entitled to his freedom, that African Americans were not and could never be citizens, and that the Missouri Compromise 1820 was unconstitutional. This ruling outraged the North and pushed the United States closer to the Civil War and to the ultimate demise of slavery. The Constitution's compromise on the balance of federal and state power has led to debates that continue to this day. For example, during the pandemic, state governments have relied on their traditional authority over public health to claim special authority to respond, arguably with negative results. According to a New York Times article, only the federal government can focus attention and resources that such a health problem demands. By dividing authority between the state and the federal government, the Constitution does not fully resolve this issue.
Finally, the Electoral College, a compromise but not a resolution, continues to evoke controversy. In both the election of 2000 and the election of 2016, one candidate won the popular vote, while the other won the Electoral College and therefore the presidency. This created a crisis of legitimacy and calls for abolishing the Electoral College entirely. We believe that the most important change to the Constitution would be to update the amendment process. We propose that 2/3 of the House and Senate should be required to propose an amendment, but once proposed, the amendment be submitted to a direct vote of the people. Under this process, we believe it would be more possible to enact a second important amendment, one that changes the Electoral College system to election by the popular vote or by vote in congressional districts, similarly to the current system in Maine and Nebraska. We are now open for questions.
I want to probe a little bit more on the proposed change to the amendment process. So you would start in Congress and then you would eliminate the role of states altogether and submit to a direct vote by the people in presumably a national election. And I want to probe a little bit what the original reasons given by the convention delegates were for designing the Article 5 amendment process as they originally did.
Well, originally the Constitution said, well, the founders said that they thought that there should be a constitutional convention every certain years and change the Constitution up to the time that we are in. And as we can see from history, there has not been another constitutional convention. And I feel like that has to do a lot with how hard the amendment process is, because if we did have a constitutional convention, there could be more amendments or just a new constitution that would go over the amendments that we are needing.
In addition, Madison also proposed this as a form of checks and balances within the government, and that they didn't want the amendment process to be too easy because it would then easily be able to impact people's rights, as they just gotten out of the Articles of Confederation, which provided for too much democracy, and change was too easily able to happen.
Additionally, Madison did not want to give this power directly to the states because he believed that that would give the states too much power. And by amending this process so that the people would have the power, it would allow for more democracy to be brought into our government, which is necessary for the United States to continue to evolve.
So in your estimation, do you think the process that you've proposed would make it more or less difficult to amend the Constitution?
We believe that our process proposed that would make the Constitution a little bit easier to ratify, as instead of having to gain the approval of 3/4 of the states, you just have to gain the approval of the people.
And would it be a simple majority of the people, or it would be a supermajority of the people?
We proposed it would be a simple majority. However, that would be incredibly difficult to initially pass this amendment of changing the amendments, because that would then mean that people who had smaller populations would have to vote towards having less representation within the amendment process.
We see this difficulty show up in the Constitutional Convention, which is why we know that there would be controversy over this change.
Thank you. I will open up for my colleagues to post their questions.
So I don't know much about this question. You brought it up, so I'm curious. Can you explain again what the constitutional implications are of states as opposed to the federal government responding to the pandemic? And what do you think? What rights and responsibilities were implicated as states and the federal government worked on that?
Traditionally, public health is a state issue, and so the power was given to the states as well. During President Trump's presidency, he did not have the same command over the pandemic that Biden does now, with pushing states to get vaccines out and pushing mask mandates. while President Trump kind of politicized the COVID response. And by doing that, the states had very different responses. And by the states having different responses, it has led to the pandemic continuing for longer than it should have.
To add on to my colleague, we would additionally say that by President Trump having such an impact on states originally, he's led to them continuing to have their same outlook on it right now, which has led to a lot of a lot of states not wanting to follow Biden. We can see this in states like Florida.
Additionally, we can also see this through some colleges. More than 50 colleges have now required vaccinations for the 2021 school year, 2022.
Thank you.
You mentioned the Bill of Rights in your opening remarks. Can you say more about this debate? Why was Madison and Hamilton and those like him opposed to having a Bill of Rights? What kind of arguments did they have for that? And what was the response from the Anti-Federalists to that?
Madison and Hamilton believed that the rights in the Bill of Rights were already mentioned in the Constitution, and therefore they didn't need a Bill of Rights to mention it.
Specifically in Federalist 84, Hamilton references the aspects within the Constitution that do protect the individual rights of the people, and Madison's main fear was that by listing out these rights, it would rather limit the rights of people instead of limiting the national government, which is why ultimately in the first 10 amendments throughout the Bill of Rights, they decided to limit the national government rather than limiting the people's rights.
The Anti-Federalist response to this initial argument against the Bill of Rights was obviously met with disagreement with the Anti-Federalists, and it was also influenced by a lot of the arguments made by the Anti-Federalists were also influenced by states, as they didn't want the federal government to intrude on their rights and their fundamental rights.
And it eventually got passed because without the Bill of Rights, the Anti-Federalists would not have signed on to the ratification. And the Bill of Rights was influenced by states like the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Yeah.
Ask a follow-up question. So you mentioned that the consequences of the compromises over slavery at the convention led in part to the Civil War. And I wonder if you could comment on what the modern day legacy of slavery is in this country.
One modern thing is that the people are debating over whether or not slave families should be compensated for their families being slaves.
Additionally, we see the consequences of slavery in many aspects of the United States as an institution, because since it was such a large part of the economy, many things were based around that, and those implications are still here today. For example, through the school system and through there being a disproportionate amount of education between white kids and African American kids, through the policing system with the disproportionate amount of African Americans getting killed. All of these are results of slavery.
In addition, during the time of the Constitution, they'd never addressed slavery, which overall created an unawareness about the issue. And we saw this through the Three-Fifths Compromise, giving the Southern states greater power within representation in the government. And this further affected as time went on.
Probably have about 20 or 30 seconds left if anybody wants to give a closing thought on that final question. All right, and there's time. Thanks so much. This is just a little bit of time that we have to give you guys some constructive feedback. And so I'll go ahead and start. I think you did a nice job of drawing out some of the major issues at the convention. So focusing on representation, slavery. You mentioned the Bill of Rights. Tried to get to this in my follow-up question, and I think Judge Drummond did the same thing, which is sort of pulling, you did a good job on representation. We just wanted you to go a little bit deeper on slavery and the Bill of Rights. You were able to do that, thankfully, in the follow-up questions. This is the first time today that we've heard the pandemic brought up when it comes to federal and state relations. I thought that was interesting to bring up. Would have loved to hear a little bit more on the Electoral College reform and why you thought that was a good idea. But overall, I think you did a nice job of answering all of the questions. You worked really well together as a team, and there was really even participation across both your hearing testimony and your responses to the questions.
I'd agree. I thought it was an excellent conversation. I also would have loved to hear more about the Electoral College, although I appreciate the specific references to the 2000 and 2016 elections. I like the strong writing. The crisis of legitimacy, I think, is a very good and concise description of what we face. That the 3/5 compromise was inexcusable. You know, which I think is completely defensible to describe it that way. I think the harder thing then is to follow up with, and here's what we should do. But that's, of course, the work of a nation, not just of a team. And I also liked, in response to Judge Silverbrook's question, the response to what are the downstream effects of the failure of founders to address slavery properly or effectively. And policing, I think, is certainly an important one. So that was good that that was mentioned. I think at that moment, you could also discuss voting rights or voting suppression and how that affects different portions of the country. And over incarceration. I mean, this is so many avenues you can go here, and then I could see in your faces, you know that already, but I did appreciate the conversation. So thank you very much.
So I echo much of what my colleagues have said. Very much liked how all of you had important and intelligent points to make. You made them, right? There wasn't, no one was slacking on your team. I appreciate the team effort there. With my question about the Bill of Rights, I thought you did a great job with the Federalist portion of it. The Anti-Federalist portion, I thought you did a good job too. The one thing maybe I would have liked to see a little bit deeper on was a bit more technical. Yes, they were worried about the states being annihilated, but why? The why being they pointed to specific clauses in the Constitution, the necessary and proper clause, the supremacy clause, the general welfare clause, that these could be used to slowly but eventually annihilate the state governments. But Mr. Archer, you seem to know that. You seem to know the big point there. So well done.
Okay, well then that takes us to the end of this hearing. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this time, and then